is Serafina and the Black Cloak, Chapter 19. I need a plan, Serafina thought as she went down the stairs into the basement, and it has to be tonight. As she ate a late-night dinner with her pa in the workshop, she wanted to tell him everything and beg for his help to save Braden, but there were no bodies, no weapons, no evidence of any kind to support what her pa would call her imaginings about the Vanderbilt's most trusted guest. Even her best friend didn't believe her. Her pa never would. But more than that, her pa looked so worn out. His hands were blackened and raw with the day's work on the Edison machine. He was under fierce pressure to get the lights back on, and rightly so. The darkness made the whole house the demon's domain. But then she stopped in mid-thought and realized something. The darkness made it her domain as well. "Are you all right?" her father asked as he scraped up the last of his potatoes with his spoon. "You haven't eaten anything." She pulled herself out of her thoughts, looked at her pa, and nodded. "I'm all right." "Listen, Sarah," her pa said. "I want you to hunker down tonight. Keep to yourself, you hear?" "I hear, Pa," she said obediently, but of course she wouldn't. She couldn't. When they went to bed and her pa began to snore, she slipped out of the workshop and climbed the stairs that led outside to the estate grounds. Her mind was a whirl with thoughts and images and fears. She knew her pa wanted her to stay close to him, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel safe in the basement. Staying in the basement tonight was death. It was doom. It would lead to a loneliness she could not bear. Over the last few days, she had felt increasingly constrained there. She didn't want to be inside anymore. She wanted the freedom of open space and true darkness. As she walked outside, it was a beautiful moonlit night, with a light snow gently falling in the grass and trees. She tried to think it all through. She knew what she had to do. She just didn't know how to do it. What stratagem could she devise to defeat the man in the black cloak? If he were a rat, how would she catch him? She walked to the edge of the forest and paused at the point her pa had told her when she should never go beyond. Her first foray into the shadows of the forest 2 nights before had been difficult, terrifying, but she kept going. She pushed through the thick brush and walked into the trees. She delved into the forest, using the moonlight and the starlight to illuminate her way. Despite all that had happened, she was still drawn here. This was where she wanted to be. A glint of light caught her eye. She looked up and saw a falling star, then another, then 10 dashing through the blackness, then 100 at once. A shower of falling stars streaked across the sky, filling the crystalline black heavens with blazing light. And then the shower was gone, leaving nothing but the stillness of the glistening stars and the glowing planets in the infinite space above her. She heard tiny footsteps behind her. A small country mouse out foraging and now making his way back home to his family, warm beneath a hollowed log. The forest was alive at night, filled with motion, sound, creatures, and light. She felt comfortable here, connected. She walked a little farther, studying the lichen-covered rocks, the trees with their outstretched limbs, the little rills of glistening water that ran beneath the ferns. Was this the forest her mother had come from? Was this where she belonged? She thought about why she could see that Mr. Thorne was the man in the black cloak, but no one else could, not even Braden. Why could she believe it, but they could not? Because they were normal, mortal human beings, and she was not. She was closer to the man in the black cloak than she wished to admit, closer to being a demon. She knew she couldn't fight the man in the black cloak directly. He was far too strong. In their first encounter, she had barely escaped him with her life. A shiver ran down her spine just thinking about it. But she couldn't just keep running away and hiding from him either. Somehow she had to stop him. But he possessed an otherworldly power. If her theory about him was correct, then he had fallen within him all the strength and capability of every person he'd ever absorbed into his cloak. And if she gave him another chance, he would surely absorb her as well. No, she couldn't fight the man in the black cloak head on, not alone. She looked around her, and a dark idea formed in her mind. She asked herself the question again. If he were a rat, how would she catch him? And suddenly, she knew the answer. She'd bait him. Fear rose up in her like bile from a half-digested meal. She wanted to turn away from the idea to avoid it, but her mind kept going back to it as the only solution. She thought of her Paul's words once more. Never go into the deep parts of the forest, for there are many dangers there, both dark and bright. You're right, Paul, she thought. There are, and I'm one of them. Standing in the woods, she came to a conclusion about herself, something that she'd known deep down for a long time, but that she had never wanted to come to grips with. She was not like her Paul. She was not like Braden. She was not human, at least not entirely. The thought of it brought a lump to her throat. She felt a terrible loneliness. She didn't know what it meant. She wasn't even sure she wanted to know what it meant, but she knew it was true. She was not like the people she loved. She'd been born in the forest, a forest as black as the black cloak and as haunted as the graveyard. She was one of them, a creature of the night. She'd overheard Mr. Pratt say that the creatures of the night came straight from hell, that they were evil. She wondered about it again, her mind pushing through thorny brambles of conflict and confusion. Did evil creatures think of themselves as evil, or did they think they were doing what was right? Was evil something that was in your heart, or was it how people viewed you? She felt like she was good, but was she actually bad and just didn't know it? She lived underground. She slinked through the darkness without being seen or heard. She secretly listened to people's conversations. She pawed through their belongings when they weren't in their rooms. She killed animals. She battled. She lied. She stole. She hid. She watched children lose their souls. And yet she was still living, thriving, even drawing energy and knowledge and awareness from each and every night that she prowled through the darkness, and another child was taken. She stood for a long time thinking about why she was alive and the others weren't. And she asked herself again, was she good or was she evil? She'd been born in and lived in the world of darkness, but which side was she on, darkness or light? She looked up at the stars. She didn't know what she was or how she got that way, but she knew what she wanted to be. She wanted to be good. She wanted to save Braden and the other children who were still alive. She wanted to protect Biltmore. She thought about the inscription at the base of the stone angel's pedestal. Our character isn't defined by the battles we win or lose, but by the battles we dare to fight. Standing in the forest at that moment, that's what she chose to believe. She chose to believe. It was true that she was a creature of the night, but she would decide for herself what that meant. She had two choices before her, to slink away and hide or to dare to fight. At that moment, she saw a plan in her mind and knew what she must do. A part of her didn't want to do it. It would mean she could well die this very night. And her death would come at the moment in her life when she had finally crawled out of the basement and found a friend and began to understand and to connect to the world around her. She wanted to go home and sleep in front of Braden's fireplace and eat chicken and grits with her pa and pretend like none of this was happening. She wanted to curl up in the basement behind the boiler and hide like she'd done all her life, but she couldn't. Thorne was going to keep coming. He was going to take Braden's life. She had to stop him. She might die, but it meant that Braden might live. He'd go on with Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt and his horses and with Gideon at his side. And that, she decided, more than anything was what she wanted. She wanted Braden to live. She'd seen with her own eyes that the man in the black cloak absorbed any child he encountered. But she knew that he wanted Braden Vanderbilt next. She'd seen this when the man in the black cloak attacked them in the forest. He hadn't come for Nolan. He'd gone straight for Braden. There was a talent in Braden that Thorne craved. Braden's expertise in horsemanship. But more than that, his almost telepathic connection to animals. She imagined what it would be like to be able to befriend all the animals around her, even to control them. But she sensed there was something more as well, something that obsessed Mr. Thorne, that drove him even beyond Braden. More and more he had to take a child every night, any child. And she used that need against him. She would meet him face to face on the most deadly battlefield she could think of. She would defeat him once and for all, or she'd die trying. She turned around and headed back toward the estate. As midnight approached, she went down the stairs toward the workshop. It did not surprise her that her pa was asleep in his cot, snoring gently, exhausted from a long, difficult day. But then she saw something lying on her makeshift bed behind the boiler. As she stepped toward it, she realized it was the dress that Braden had given her. Braden must have come down and laid it there while she was gone. There was a note attached. S. A and U are determined. I'm leaving early in the morning with T. I'll see you in a few days. Please stay safe until I return. B. Serafina stared at the note. She didn't want to believe it. He was really going to do what his aunt and uncle wanted. But then she looked at the dress. She wasn't sure it wasn't Braden's intention, but it was a perfect addition to her plan. Now she would look the part. The time for sneaking and hiding was over. She was going to make sure one man in particular saw her, and tonight was the night. The chief rat catcher had a job to do.